My name is Michael Malay, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Bristol, where I teach in the English department. I'm the author of a book called Late Light, which is a book about what it's like to live through an extinction crisis and the kinds of ethical and political and imaginative responses that are needed to respond adequately to what's happening to the living world. In particular, it's about eels, moths, crickets, and mussels, which are, those animals are deliberately chosen because I wanted to focus on so-called non-charismatic species, precisely in order to challenge this idea that there's such a thing as a non-charismatic species. The belief I had going into this book, and which was strengthened for me in the writing of it, was that there's no such thing as a non-charismatic species, and that anything you look at carefully and tenderly and attentively enough becomes intricate, confounding, alive, and kind of endlessly fascinating. And I think it's also a book that is asking the reader to pay attention to the overlooked and the neglected, and to recalibrate the way we think about other animals. Essentially, for me, it's a book about how to become more generous neighbors and to find more thoughtful and careful and beautiful ways of sharing land with our neighbors, sharing stories, sharing the world with other species. The book actually began as an academic project. It was not a nature writing book, and I was interested in, at the time, and I was interested in meeting conservationists and environmentalists and asking them what it was like to live in the midst of an ecological crisis. And my original plan was to interview a range of people who were involved in some kind of conservation or environmental work around the country, and to learn from them what motivated them to work on the particular species or habitats they worked on, how they ended up dedicating their lives to those creatures and places, and the kinds of hopes that kept them going, but also the fears and anxieties that they also lived with as they were doing this work. And seeing those people inspired me in a way to think about my own connections to my local landscapes in Bristol, and to ask to myself, or for myself, what were my worst fears and also best hopes about the future. What was my connection to the landscape? So the book originally began as this academic project, but the more I encountered people on the road and in the fields, and the more I heard their stories, the more their stories brought out my personal connections, my personal stories. And without me ever planning this, and very slowly and organically, I found myself writing a kind of memoir. I found that my own stories were emerging in the process of doing this research in the field. And I'm glad I followed that path as it opened up before me, because I think the academic book I was writing is of interest and was saying interesting things about how conservationists and environmentalists live with crisis. But I think what I hope what my book does is also help those stories land in the lives of readers, precisely by bringing my own story to the not to the fore, because for me the animals are the stars, they are the protagonists of my book, but I wanted my story to somehow illuminate the lives of the creatures I was writing about. One of the things I struggled with and thought a lot about while writing this book was precisely this question of how much of myself to bring into the story.
Right.
Because I didn't ever want the self or the subject to override or exclude the stories of the animals that I was also trying to weave into the book. And the terms that I started to work with, or that came to mind for me, were allegory and resonance. And for me, allegory is when the natural world is absorbed into the human story. And I really wanted to avoid that. I didn't want the eels to simply be a way of thinking about human migration or about human stories. Because I think that would have been, ethically very problematic. Animals are literally disappearing before our eyes. And if, as a writer, I was absorbing animals into my story, they would have suffered a kind of double disappearance, physically from the landscape, but also their stories would have been elided or somehow colonized by the personal voice. So against allegory, the thing that I really hope the book does is find resonances. That's the other term that was really key for me. I want the human stories to be resonant with the stories of the more than human creatures, places, and processes that I write about. And for me, that there's a key difference between allegory and resonance. Allegory brings nature into the human world, whereas resonance finds these points of connection, these affinities between the human and the more than human. And I tried really hard to make sure that every time I brought the human voice in, it was never in an allegorical way. It was always in a resonant way, to try to open up these lines of connection with the human and the non-human. For me, what I really hope a reader takes away from this is a willingness or a new desire to connect.
Yep.
To connect the personal and the political, to connect here with there, to connect the ecological with the cultural. What I continually discovered when writing this book was that the divisions and the partitions we have set up in our minds, but also politically and culturally in our stories between nature and society are deeply false and problematic in all sorts of ways. And what I hope the book does is to just gently but insistently say that this thing here is connected to that thing there. And the moth that you see in your garden, even though it's this tiny thing, contains this macrocosmic story about contemporary Britain and our relationship with the land and with the more than human world. I think of all books actually as connecting machines. They're machines that connect the world together. But I think especially nature writing books need to sort of counteract the partitions that are set up by contemporary culture and just say, no, this thing that we think of as separate or as out there, it's in here, it's part of us, it's part of how it's part of our deep story, and our deep story is part of the story of the creatures around us as well. Funnily enough, one of the images that came to my mind when I was writing this book, I don't know how or why it came to my mind, but I started to think as I was working through the second and third draft who a reader of this book might be. And the person that came to mind was a 16-year-old teenager in Sussex. I don't know why I chose Sussex, but I had a very strong sense of this person as my reader. I wanted to connect with someone who is a young person, someone who is curious, someone who knew what the scale of the challenges were, but who also needed a kind of companion to help them navigate some of those complexities. And there is a lot of loss and sadness in the book. There's a lot of melancholy in the book. And at the same time, I hope there's a lot of joy and curiosity and tenderness, because those things are also vital experiences that connect us. Again, that word comes up, that connects us to the natural world. And yes, there is a place for lament, there's a place for bewilderment, there's a place for disorientation. I think a lot of us feel that in our bones, in our bodies. And at the same time, there's a place for that spark of energy and curiosity and joy that we experience. And for me, the joy sits alongside the melancholy. They're so closely connected. We feel melancholy precisely because we love the things, or we care for the things that we see are disappearing. But joy has to be part of our politics, part of our vision, because that is joy is such an energizing, connecting force. It's a politically powerful experience, and for me, when I was writing this book, I had to walk this balance between bewilderment and tenderness, and I was always thinking of that 16-year-old reader in Sussex. I wanted to connect with them in such a way that didn't shut down their capacity to open themselves to what was going on. I was aware of the need to describe things in a sober and clear-eyed way. We are living in landscapes of loss and erosion and unraveling, and you have to tell that story because that is going on, and neglecting that or somehow dampening that is ethically deeply problematic for me. I think you have to tell the truth. So I hope that the book is really upfront and really clear about the extraordinary losses that our animal neighbors are experiencing. But to go back to your question, I think you can easily reach a place, and I know myself, I've reached this place many times, where you feel so debilitated and so overwhelmed by the toxic tide of newspaper articles announcing the latest habitat that's been destroyed, or the latest species that has made it onto an endangered species list. And I think at a certain point, what we need isn't information about the crisis. We have so much information about the crisis. I think what we need are stories, and living stories about what it's like to be a mature human being at this time. And for me, to go back to this earlier question, that is connected to this question of joy and tenderness. And I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but I really hope that the book is honest and at the same time doesn't induce a sense of powerlessness. I hope that it gives readers a sense of agency and over their own lives and over the changes they can make in their patch of land, but also the connections they can make with other organizations, with other people, the different scales at which we need to move as individuals and as communities. I hope it doesn't create eco-anxiety. At the same time, I hope it's honest and unvarnished. And I hope it gives readers a sense of wonder as well as sadness. And I think those two, out of that dialectical relationship between sadness and wonder, my feeling is that something like a soul is forged, or stretched. Sadness stretches us one way, wonder stretches us another way. And what that creates is something really full and whole and human. And I think we need both aspects of that story. Being longlisted was already an incredible thing, being shortlisted was beyond what I expected, and being a recipient of the recipient of the prize is it's extraordinary. For some reason, what's coming to mind is when I many years ago, when I was a boy in Australia, I remember reading a book about England. I can't remember who it was by. Maybe it was a Roald Dahl book. And I remember coming across the words hedgerow. And I thought, oh, what is this word hedgerow? For a long time that was in my mind, this word hedgerow. And when I finally came to England when I was 21 years old, I started hearing people speak about hedgerows. And then I realized that the word I had in my mind as a boy was a misreading. I had misread hedgerow for hedgerow. And I've come a long way from that misreading as a boy, because with friends now, when we go for walks, we sort of name and sing the names of the plants that we see. And I love the connection that names have given me with the things that I see. I love seeing mugwort. I love seeing dandelion. I love seeing cowslip in the spring. I love seeing primrose. And so I'm sort of reflecting on my own journey here as a migrant, to go from hedgerow to hedgerow to being on the short list of a prize like this. It's been quite a journey for me, and I'm exceptionally proud to be in the company of really gifted writers who are telling the kinds of stories I think we desperately need right now.